Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 Pacific on PRI. This is PRI, an award-winning independent leading producer and distributor of quality public...
Support comes from One World Theater, presenting Mary Black August 1st, Livingston Taylor August 10th, and Pieces of a Dream on August 11th. Tickets and season schedule at oneworldtheater.org.
Marketplace Weekend is ceasing production at the end of this month, and we want to know which show you think should replace it. You can vote on which of 4 shows should take over Saturdays at 2 p.m. Cast your vote right now at KUT.org. I'm Jerry Quijano, and this is community-supported public radio from UT Austin, KUT 90.5.
Hello, I'm Caroline Wyatt, and welcome to The World This Week, the programme that tells you how the world has changed in the past 7 days. This was the week when Donald Trump's turbulent tour of Europe closed with a controversial meeting, and the president corrected his own statement about Russian interference in the election that brought him to power.
In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't, or why it wouldn't be Russia.
Collusion or chaos? We ask, are we seeing the decline of the West? The week when Europe and Japan signed the world's biggest trade deal, even though others are being torn up. And when lynchings in India provoked action from an unexpected quarter.
The Supreme Court has this sort of role where it can advise governments on certain policies or even set policies in a way that you wouldn't think a court would do.
All that after this.
Hello, I'm Jerry Smith with the BBC News. Israeli military officials say there have been no further airstrikes or other operations on targets in the Gaza Strip since last night. The Palestinian group Hamas says a ceasefire has been brokered by the United Nations and Egypt. But on Friday, Israeli forces hit dozens of targets in Gaza. As Tom Bateman reports.
The airstrikes came after an Israeli soldier was shot dead, the first such fatality for Israel since the start of regular protests, which have seen more than 140 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces since March. Early this morning, Hamas announced a ceasefire agreement. There was no comment from Israel. The latest exchange of fire raised fears of a significant escalation between the two sides, with Israel's defense minister earlier warning it was being pushed towards a broad and painful military operation. The UN's envoy to the region warned that Gaza was on the brink of war and urged restraint.
Members of the Conservative People's Party in Spain are choosing a new leader to replace Mariano Rajoy. He's retiring after being ousted as Prime Minister in a confidence vote last month. Thousands of delegates gathered at a hotel in Madrid to hear the two candidates make final appeals for support. The former Deputy Prime Minister, Soraya Sanz de Santa Maria, is vying for the top job along with the 37-year-old Congressman Pablo Casado. It's vowed to take the party further to the right. The winner will lead the opposition to Spain's minority socialist government. Facebook has suspended another data collection firm from using its site while it investigates claims that Boston-based Crimson Hexagon may have been using people's information to build surveillance tools. Here's Dave Lee.
Crimson Hexagon says it collects the vast amounts of public data in order to provide consumer insights, something that is not against Facebook's policies. However, the Wall Street Journal newspaper has reported the data firm worked with a group linked to the Kremlin, as well as various US government agencies. Using Facebook data for surveillance is against the site's policies, and so the network has launched an investigation.
Cuba's lawmakers are expected to approve a new constitution later today, which will then be put to a public vote. The sweeping reforms would see private property recognised for the first time since 1976. Will Grant is in Havana.
The new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, is seeking to preserve the socialist character of the Cuban Revolution while boosting the long stagnant economy on the island. Nevertheless, state and military-run entities will remain dominant in Cuba. Other key changes include the introduction of a prime minister to the Cuban political system, dividing the roles of head of state and head of government, and the imposition of term limits on the presidency of 2 consecutive 5-year terms.
World news from the BBC. Leaders of Pakistan's Ahmadi minority community say they're boycotting the forthcoming elections because of what they say are discriminatory laws. They've complained that Ahmadis have been placed on a separate voter registration list, categorizing them as non-Muslim. Community leaders say this violates their right to religious self-identity as Muslim. Investigators examining how 17 people died when their tourist boat sank on a lake in the US state of Missouri have asked witnesses to send in their videos. And they're questioning why passengers appear not to have used their life jackets. James Cook reports.
Divers and other rescue workers have now recovered all 17 bodies from the lake where the duck boat was struck by an intense thunderstorm. Videos posted online show the craft slowly being driven back by the wind and swamped by waves before it capsized and sank. Police say a 1-year-old baby is among the dead, while the Missouri Governor's office told the BBC that 9 of the 17 victims were from one family and that 2 other members of that family had survived. Investigators have appealed for witnesses to send in their videos and will also examine why the duck boats were on the water when a weather warning had been issued.
Police in the northern Indian state of Rajasthan say a mob has killed a Muslim man on suspicion of smuggling cows, and the latest in a string of similar attacks. Cattle are revered by Hindus, and killing them is illegal in several Indian states. Reports said the deceased man and a colleague were transporting cows when they were attacked. In recent years, there have been a series of attacks on Muslim cattle traders and lower caste Dalits, for whom beef is a staple food. The authorities in Japan are urging people to take precautions as a severe heatwave continues across much of the country. More than 30 people are reported to have died over the past 2 weeks. Thousands of others have sought hospital treatment. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Caroline Wyatt and welcome back to The World This Week. Donald Trump's turbulent tour of Europe ended in Helsinki and in utter confusion. At a news conference there with Russian President Vladimir Putin, the US leader appeared to suggest that, in contrast with his own intelligence agencies, he believed Mr. Putin had not interfered in the last US election, the election that Mr. Trump won. On his arrival back home, though, Mr. Trump claimed he'd misspoken and forgotten to insert the word not. Later, he announced he'd invited Mr. Putin to visit the US later this year. America's Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, was among those to be taken by surprise as he was told of the president's plans while at a conference.
We have some breaking news. The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again. That's going to be special.
So what changed thanks to the Trump tornado that tore first through NATO, then the UK, the golf course in Scotland, and ended with some feeling that Mr. Trump made foes of his friends and friends with America's real foe? Our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue followed the president's progress and is back in Washington, and Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow.
We've just had the World Cup here, and it looks as if Vladimir Putin keeps scoring. He scored the goal with the Helsinki summit, and now potentially a summit in Washington, which will be a massive goal for the Russian president. You can see that the Russian state media here are very confident, very pleased about what's happening. And if Donald Trump wants to hear some praise from the media, then he should switch on Russian television. There was a news bulletin which said that it was a wonderful thing that Donald Trump had invited Vladimir Putin to Washington, because in recent days Trump has been called all names under the sun in America, from a wet noodle to Putin's poodle. But by inviting Vladimir Putin to the White House, Donald Trump is showing his true self.
Gary, Trump has been much criticised for being friendlier to Putin than to his traditional US allies. Has this genuinely damaged him at home, even though I suppose most of the criticism did come from people who were already opponents of Mr. Trump or who were planning to leave office shortly?
Certainly in terms of his base, they couldn't give tuppence halfpenny about relations with NATO or with the EU or anything like that. NATO and the EU are a very, very long way away if you live in Wisconsin or Michigan or anything like that. So I don't think that'll worry him at all. But I think there is a concern, certainly here in Washington, and you've seen this in not just those elements of the Republican Party that are leaving, but in other parts of it too, that some potential long-term damage is being done with key allies.
The headline said Putin won, Trump nil. Is that fair?
Some people might say the score was Putin 5, Trump nil. I mean, certainly the reaction in Russia has been that this Helsinki summit and everything that's followed it was a big victory for the Kremlin. Don't forget that Vladimir Putin is the head of a state which has been accused of trying to undermine Western institutions, of threatening the international order. The charge list against Vladimir Putin's Russia is very long, and yet here was Vladimir Putin sitting down at the table with Donald Trump, being exactly where Vladimir Putin wants to be, at the top table of geopolitics.
Well, certainly if you speak to or listen to the intelligence elite, you listen to much of the political elite on both sides, you listen to the parliamentariat, etc., then they go along with that 5-0 score. It was seen by many here as an utter national shaming, really. However, there has been some polling of Republican voters, and you see in that substantial numbers of Republican voters, anything between 68% and 79%, believe that the president handled that summit well. So you're seeing him doubling down on social media in terms of the summit's success, etc. Yes, of course, there's had to be a whole bunch of different elements of clean-up that the White House have been doing this week. But on the main point that talking to Vladimir Putin is a good thing, that he's defending America's interest, on that he's not giving an inch.
And Steve, how did Russians see the meeting and this apparent closeness between Trump and Putin?
If you're talking about the Russian people, then this doesn't play very big. It's not really on people's agenda. You know, people have had other problems, more pressing problems to deal with, particularly pension reform, which is the number one issue at the moment for Russians. But certainly when they switch on their television sets and watch the evening news or on state TV, they can see that the events of Helsinki are being portrayed as a victory for Vladimir Putin. And certainly they're being told that this is the start of a new era in US-Russian relations. Certainly Moscow is hopeful that after quite a long period of tension between East and West, with a pro-Russia president in the White House, that they will be able to find a common language and actually start to bend fences. But I think the big question is going to be, when you look at the bipartisan criticism that Donald Trump has come in for in the last few days from Democrats and Republicans, will he be in a position to deliver the kind of reset and possibly the kind of concessions that Moscow wants?
And Gary, how shocking was it that Trump appeared to be so close to Putin on so many topics on Monday?
Well, I think it was shocking. I mean, the immediate reaction was one of amazement, astonishment, horror from many people. At one senator with a verging on treasonous, on high crimes, someone else talked about. When I was in Helsinki with Steve, certainly in the overflow area where I was, the journalists, including the Russian journalists, there were gasps at various points when the president was speaking. His failure really to endorse his own country's intelligence services at that time, in that room, in that moment, was something that was really shocking to people. And that amazing moment with football, which just looked like a brilliant stroke by the Russian president in terms of kind of infantilizing the US president playing football, which he didn't really know what to do with. only going in one direction. Now, that is something that Donald Trump doesn't like at all, in the sense that any hint of weakness, any hint of being played, not really understanding what's going on, is something that will get under his skin significantly.
Steve, both Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump have said it's good to talk, and that does appear to be true. Are the critics being unfair at all about this relationship?
Of course it's good to talk, and of course dialogue is better than conflict, and of course there are key issues here where dialogue is necessary. For example, arms control. There is a key nuclear disarmament treaty that expires in less than 3 years' time, and the two sides need to sit down and to talk about this if it's to be extended. They need to talk about other flashpoints like Ukraine and Syria.
There were no note-takers in their one-on-one meeting. Is that something that is going to change for the next one?
Well, in a sense, that's down to the president, but you're right, and we still don't know what was said in that meeting. And so to have a second summit on the horizon, really quite soon, to have something like that coming up, the preparations need, without even knowing what happened in the first one, is something that is making people kind of spin and worry about what on earth they can possibly do, and that they may be heading for yet another own goal, this time an even more humiliating one on home soil.
Gary O'Donoghue and Steve Rosenberg. Well, one of the features of the Trump administration has been its aversion to multilateral deals. It pulled out of a trans-Pacific trade deal even before the US had properly entered it, and is busy renegotiating its deal with Mexico and Canada. So a huge deal signed this week between the European Union and Japan marked a change of direction, or at least a reversion to the way things were before Mr. Trump. The new deal covers 600 million people and almost 30% of the world's GDP. It contrasts sharply with actions by the Trump administration, which has introduced steep import tariffs on many goods in a trade battle with much of the rest of the world, and it's threatening more. I asked our economics correspondent Andrew Walker to tell me why the deal matters.
The implications for world trade are simply that it will provide a significant lowering of barriers to trade between Japan and the European Union, and we can expect to see over time a significant, not massive, but certainly a significant increase in, for example, Japanese cars being sold into Europe, and we can also expect to see European plastics, chemicals, cosmetics, and quite a lot of agricultural produce as well. This has been characterised by some slightly unkind people as a cars for cheese kind of agreement, and there's no question, I think, that there will be significant increases in trade in both those two commodities, but more to it.
The head of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has said that the deal underlined the win-win solutions offered by free trade, and it feels as though this marks a very different direction to what we've seen over the past year with Donald Trump on world trade.
Yes, so the great majority of economists, the overwhelming majority, frankly, would say that countries do gain from liberalising their trade. Two countries make an agreement, both countries are likely to gain. They will, however, insist that there will be losers within countries. People and businesses that are suddenly exposed to more competition are likely to see job losses and costs associated with finding new employment, and perhaps lower incomes as a result. But overall, countries, most economists would say, do gain. President Trump certainly doesn't see things like that. He sees a trade deficit as being a sign that you're losing, and he has been very assertive about trying to tackle countries that are, as he sees it, taking advantage of the United States, that have trade agreements that were done by previous US administrations that he regards as having been poorly constructed and putting the US at a disadvantage.
And staying with Donald Trump, the IMF has warned the US president that the current threats made by the US on raising tariffs risk lowering worldwide economic growth by 0.5% by 2020. That would mean a global loss of over $400 billion. And at the same time, China has filed a complaint against the US at the World Trade Organization. Are we heading still towards a global trade war?
Well, I'd say on the question of complaints to the WTO, countries do that all the time, and that's the way the system is supposed to work. I think the more worrying things from the perspective of people who believe that unimpeded or relatively there certainly is a concern there. The IMF has certainly been raising the issue that perhaps the current rate of economic growth, they're projecting 3.9%, may be at the high water mark, and they do see the prospect of further escalating trade tensions as being one of the biggest threats to it. There are a couple of issues. First, the trade barriers themselves do directly have an impact on economic activity because they do mean that resources are not used in the most efficient way. But there's also the fact that they may have a chilling effect on investment by business. And I think that's probably the bigger concern for the long term.
Andrew Walker. You're listening to The World This Week, the programme that tells you what happened in the past 7 days and why it counts. Coming up, is it all over for the West? We'll examine what the rise of populism, the new economic giants of China and India, means for the dominant powers of the 20th century. And if you want to listen to us again, or previous editions, type BBC The World This Week into your search engine. The messaging service WhatsApp has announced restrictions on its service in India to try to curb the spread of malicious rumours. Several fake stories have led to mob lynchings. The company owned by Facebook has said it will look to limit the mass forwarding of messages. False allegations about child abductions and the harming of cows in a nation where they're revered by Hindus have led to several deaths this year. This week, the Supreme Court in India asked Parliament to legislate against what it describes as a spreading menace of lynch mobs. Our South Asia editor, Joanna Jolly, explains.
There are essentially two types of lynchings that are going on in India at the moment. On the one hand, you have what are known as cow lynchings, and this is when a group of men go out and they identify people who they think in some way have been involved with cows. That's either maybe slaughtering them for beef or eating beef or handling them or smuggling them illegally, and those people are identified and beaten, and often beaten to death. And there's been a definite increase in the number of these attacks in the last 10 years. 24 of the people who died were Muslims, because it's mainly the minority Muslim population in India who handle cows and beef, because to them the cow isn't sacred and holy as it is to the majority Hindu population. Most of the attacks have happened since Prime Minister Narendra Modi from the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP party came into power in 2014. Certainly the people who support Modi also support the ideas behind cow lynching and who support the protection of the sacred cow. And under Prime Minister Modi, the authorities haven't been quick, and Prime Minister Modi himself hasn't been quick to condemn this sort of violence. There's a second type of lynching that's going on as well. Now, this is to do with the popularity of social media and messaging groups in India, which are incredibly popular. WhatsApp is widely used, as is Facebook Messenger, and I think it's Facebook Messenger's biggest market, actually, India. What happens is that people start to disseminate video clips on these social media apps, and they often accuse random people or send a rumour around that child abductors are at work. They show videos of children being snatched off the back of motorbikes, which have come from places that have nothing to do with actual abductions, but have been cut down and put onto these messages. Now, these have caused mobs to go out and identify people who they think are potentially involved in these child abductions and to beat them to death. And quite often it's people who are outsiders who are passing through the town, or they come from a lower social group, and in some cases they're women as well. In one case it was two men who stopped their car to ask for directions, and they were dragged out of their car and lynched to death because it was believed they were up to no good in some way.
And why has the Supreme Court intervened now?
The Supreme Court in India has a slightly different role than it does in other countries, in that it's always been very closely connected with protecting fundamental human rights. And this is due to an article in the Indian Constitution that names it as the place that people can go to for a sort of final redress. And also, since the 1980s, it's been very connected to public interest litigation that socially disadvantaged groups can bring through the Indian courts. Because of this, the Supreme Court has a sort of role where it can advise governments on certain policies, or even set policies in a way that you wouldn't think a court would do. So, for instance, in India, the Supreme Court's got involved in policies on pollution. It's told people they have to wear seatbelts. It's banned the sale of alcohol in certain areas. There's been quite a large movement of people who are against cow vigilantism in particular, who have started a movement called #NotInMyName. And an activist from this movement took a petition to the Supreme Court and said, please, can you rule on this? and the Supreme Court looked to another article of the Constitution which advocated the protection of all groups from discrimination, so no singling out of religious groups or people from different castes, and said under this it felt that the government needed to act. It needed to bring in special laws, new laws to deal with this kind of lynching. It needs to set up fast-track courts where cases like this can be tried, and also to offer compensation and legal aid to victims and their families.
Joanna Jolly. Some called it Donald Trump's wrecking ball tour of Europe. Its contradictions and chaos left many foreign policy experts asking whether his actions in angering allies, befriending foes, are hastening America's fall from its position as the indispensable nation. The US remains the world's biggest economy, but China is fast catching up. Our diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus has been contemplating how the current world order is changing fast.
Karl Marx once wrote, "A spectre is haunting Europe." Now, though, it's not just Europe, but the United States as well. That spectre today is not communism, as Marx put it, but the decline of the West. The fear of decline is perhaps the natural opposite side of the coin to success. But is this a kind of political hypochondria, or is a real process of decline and fall underway? If so, is this a chain of events that is unstoppable? And how much has the arrival of President Trump accelerated or accentuated the process? Over the past 400 years or so, the West has steadily risen to global dominance. It's a period bookended by the military revolutions of the 17th century on the one hand, and the collapse of the Soviet Union on the other. Through conquest, maritime power and trade, huge European empires were established. First the Europeans, and then the US became the prime actors in global affairs. The defeat of Nazi Germany and Japan in the Second World War confirmed this position, allowing the victors, essentially the United States, to establish a range of global economic, diplomatic and security institutions that helped to shape the world in their image. With the collapse of Soviet communism, the victory was complete, or so it seemed. Some even spoke about the end of history. Liberal democracy and market capitalism had triumphed. There was no alternative model. Commentators lined up eagerly to espouse this latest trendy thinking about the end of history. How premature this all seems now. History is back. Indeed, in many parts of the world, it never went away. That brief unipolar moment of US dominance has now given way to a much more complex and turbulent world. War and instability in the Balkans and the Middle East are reflecting long-standing divisions. A world where the US and its allies are finding it harder to impose their will. Economic crises at home, a new and less impressive generation of political leaders, and uncertainty about the fairness of globalized capitalism have all led to a renewed sense of nationalism and populism. This was reflected in the Brexit vote in Britain and the victory of Mr. Trump in the United States. All of this comes against a backdrop of extraordinary technological change, the rise of a new information order that threatens both to advance and destroy existing ideas of democracy at one and the same time. And in the international order, there is clearly the relative decline of the United States as an economic power, and the rise of China, which by 2050 could have an economy 1.5 times the size of that of the United States. Into this world steps Mr. Trump. In the last 10 days, according to many pundits and commentators on both sides of the Atlantic, he has probably done more damage to US self-confidence and the integrity of the West than any other president in living memory. The West's long dominant moment on the world stage may increasingly be called into question, as countries like China and India seek their own share of influence. But consider this. Once China becomes the dominant economy in the world, its power and influence will have certainly increased. But will it seek to play the same global role as the United States? Why should it? Its culture, outlook, and worldview are entirely different. The US and maybe even Europe may still remain essential players in achieving concerted global results. They will no longer have things so much their own way. History may be back,
but it will not necessarily repeat itself.
Jonathan Marcus. That's it from The World This Week for now. If you've got any thoughts on what we've done or what you'd like us to do, please contact us at BBC World Service via Facebook or Twitter. And don't forget to join Sean Lay at the same time next week for a look back at what's happened in the next 7 days.
Distribution of the BBC World Service in the U.S. is made possible by American Public Media, producer and distributor of award-winning public radio content. APM, American Public Media, with support from Epson. The Epson EcoTank 4750 printer comes with up to 2 years of ink in the box for all your business printing needs. Cartridge-free printing with EcoTank. More information at epson.com/EcoTank.
Into a dance floor. The dance had become a political act. It has become a kind of a weapon to face the system.
And we meet Dope St. Jude, the former drag king, telling her life into lyrics and exploring queer culture and race through hip-hop. Join us after the latest BBC News.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Israel says it's carried out no further attacks on Gaza after hitting dozens of targets on Friday when one of its soldiers was shot dead. Hamas, the Palestinian group that controls the territory, says a ceasefire has been brokered by Egypt and the UN. The Spanish Conservative Party is today electing a successor to Mariano Rajoy, who left office after his government lost a confidence vote last month. The main candidates are his former deputy, Soraya Sáenz de Santa Maria, and the Congressman Pablo Casado, who take the party to the right. A US data collection firm has been suspended from using Facebook after reports that it may have used the information it collected to build surveillance tools. The company, Crimson Hexagon, is said to have worked with a group linked to the Kremlin and US government agencies. 10 former FARC rebels have taken their seats in the Colombian parliament. They were welcomed by President Juan Manuel Santos, but 2 former commanders refused to take up the posts assigned as part of the 2016 peace deal. The Cuban parliament is due to approve a new constitution today. It will later be put to a public vote. The constitution would recognize private property and limit the state's control of the economy. The Mexican president-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador has rejected a $10 million fine imposed on his party and said he will fight it in the courts. Authorities said the party had broken funding rules. Authorities in northern India say a Muslim man has been killed on suspicion of smuggling cows. It's the latest attack in a series that rights groups have blamed on extremist Hindu organizations. People in Japan have been urged to take precautions because of the current heatwave. Reports say more than 30 people have died and thousands needed hospital treatment over the past 2 weeks, with temperatures hitting the high 30s. BBC News.
From thousands on the streets of London to the first ever event in Swaziland in southern Africa. This summer, rainbow flags have been waved and people have come together all over the world to celebrate lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or LGBT pride. Hello, I'm Tina Daly. This is the programme that explores the world through the work and the voices of artists. Welcome to the Cultural Frontline. This week we are celebrating LGBT culture in dance, in music and in song.
I loved it from the first time on because it has so much attitude, super brave, super confident, homosexual attitude.
In the week that Pride comes to Berlin, we'll explore how dance culture has been transformed by the LGBT community. And we'll discover how dance can create political change.
The dance had become a political act. It has become a kind of a weapon to face the system.
That's all coming up on the Cultural Frontline. In the Republic of Georgia,
dancing to electronic music has become a political act. That's because back in May, armed riot police raided one of the country's most popular nightclubs that had been a rare safe place for the LGBT community. What followed was unprecedented. Thousands of ravers took to the streets and started dancing for freedom. One artist who joined the protesters was Erekle Deysedze. He is an author, poet and a musician known for his controversial take on the most pressing contemporary issues in Georgia. The BBC's Rehan Dimitri met him in the capital, Tbilisi.
Give me air, give me freedom, freedom of will, freedom to eat, freedom to have sex. This is one of the latest songs by 28-year-old Erekle Deysedze, one of Georgia's most controversial contemporary artists. This music video, which shows people being dragged by the police, was produced shortly after the police raided fashionable and LGBT-friendly nightclubs in Tbilisi, including the famous Basiani Club.
In recent years, we have seen unprecedented development of the clubbing scene. Unfortunately, it overlaps the development of activism in that space, which also gave an impression that a real civil society was appearing in Georgia finally, and it was pretty amazing that the spaces gave people possibility to express themselves, to be together and to accept themselves. And when these processes are going on, of course, this is going to be an object for attack.
In those raids, the police were searching for drugs. 8 drug dealers were arrested in various locations outside clubs, but none inside. Thousands took to the streets and started a protest rave. Erekle was among the protesters, and he later used the footage of street rave in his video.
The dance has become a form of political protest, that it has become a kind of a weapon to face the system, because we don't use the same weapons as the system does. We only choose peaceful methods.
The rave party went on for 2 nights. Protesters say they danced for their freedom. But soon came under attack again. This time from far-right groups. They turned up in force, shouting homophobic slogans, threatening to beat up the dancers. The police had to get involved to stop the 2 groups from clashing. To defuse the tensions, the Interior Minister appeared on stage and apologized for heavy-handed raids. Erekle has produced several videos ridiculing Georgia's strict drug laws. People can be jailed here for up to 8 years for possessing a single ecstasy tablet.
Long before the clubs were raided, demonization of drugs was ongoing. It's not like the new thing in Georgia, and there is a complete hysteria and misrepresentation around this. They speculate with drug issues, and they use the drug issue to fight the young people.
The Georgian government has defended its tactics for fighting the illegal drug trade, but it pledged to revise its drug policy, much to the frustration of Georgia's powerful Orthodox Church, which Erekle sees as fueling intolerance.
The violence against LGBT people is directly connected with the church, because it tries to make the one group of people hate another group of people and capitalize on this. This is the source of its power, instead of trying to unite them.
years ago, LGBT activists marking the International Day Against Homophobia were attacked by thousands of angry protesters led by priests. The leader of the church, Patriarch Ilya II, condemned the violence, but said the church did not support popularization of gay rights. Since those events, the Georgian Orthodox Church proclaimed 17th of May as Family Purity Day in defense of the country's traditional values. Irakli says defending minorities is an intrinsic part of his art.
Every minority needs the excess oxygen to survive. They need to survive because they create a healthy environment, and any change rests upon the minorities.
The BBC's Rehan Dimitri speaking to Irakli Desenza. And let us know what you think of the programme by using the hashtag BBC Cultural Frontline on social media. Speaking out for your rights through music is nothing new in South Africa. From Mariam Makeba to Hugh Masekela and Abdullah Ibrahim, the nation has a long tradition of musical protest. Back then, it was the apartheid regime that was challenged through music, dance and song. And now a new generation of artists are tackling issues of homophobia, as well as racism and class inequality. One of those artists is Dope St. Jude, whose real name is Catherine. She became part of Cape Town's drag community at the age of 16. Her hip-hop music is a courageous act of protest which challenges discrimination she feels as an LGBT artist and person of colour. The BBC's Audrey Brown met her to find out about her unique journey from the Cape Flats to the world stage.
So I started as a drag king. That's actually how I started in making hip-hop music. So I was dressing up as a boy and performing, like a drag queen, but the opposite of that. And I was exploring masculinity through the prism of drag performance. And then I developed and was like, actually, I don't want to just talk about what it's like to be a man. It's one-dimensional. There's only so much I can say. And that's when I started my persona as Dope St. Jude, which is an exaggerated version of myself.
Tell us about Gael. It's a very specific language. How have you used it in your music?
Basically in Gael, which is this undercover language of queer people or gay people in South Africa during the apartheid years and in the years when it was illegal to be gay. All the words in Gael are women's name. So like you say, your Harriet, your hair is Beulah. Beulah means beautiful.
And a Wendy is a white girl.
Yes. Don't you think it's a funny language? People say my Phonica is Deborah. That's so funny, to say your phone is dead.
You actually sing in Gael.
Yeah.
It's a collaboration between you and
Angel. Yeah.
Tell us about it.
We did a track called Keep in Touch, and we made a track because we felt as queer artists of color in Cape Town, we just weren't being taken very seriously, and that all the resources were kind of held in the hands of people who were not us. So we made this track kind of expressing our frustration around that. So it was an intersection of frustration as people of color, frustration as queer people.
I face you, I'ma have to replace you. You're messing with the wrong race, you. Don't have taste you, cut and paste you, pay full price.
That's just so wasteful. What about attitudes towards LGBT communities? Is it multiracial? Is it non-racial? Is it inclusive?
Your experience of queerness in Cape Town, it really depends. If you have access and privilege, it's much easier. You can walk in the street and hold your partner's hand if you're walking in a nice fancy area. No one's going to do anything to you. But I think when you start moving into the townships, into the Cape Flats, it can be much harder. Even down to the fact that me as an artist, I have to come to Europe to really have a career, speaks to how difficult it can be as a queer person to exist in South Africa. Even Pride, where the Pride is held is in the city centre, which excludes the majority of people who have actually been pushed out because of apartheid outside of the city centre. Politics and queer politics intersect all the time.
But what is it about your music that appeals outside of South Africa, do you think?
I think it's the political content. In South Africa, it's still too close to home. I don't think we've reached the stage as a country post-democracy where people are comfortable to talk about the stuff that I sometimes bring up in my music.
And what kinds of things you talk about?
So I have a track called Brown Bars, First of all, like the name brown bas. Bas is the Afrikaans word for your master during the apartheid years. So I juxtaposed having brown bas as a name.
What it's like to be brown for a girl like me? For a girl like me, do you know what it's like to be bas for a girl like me? For a girl like me, do you know what it's like to be brown for a brown like me? For a brown like me, do you know what it's like to be bas for a brown like me? For a brown like me?
And then in the track I just speak about like the experience of being a person of color and the inequality we have to deal with. Like people don't really want to be listening to that in their music just yet. I think it unsettles people. But when I go and perform that overseas, the reception is very different because it's not a problem that people actually have to deal with in their lives. But it's in Africa, it's our problem.
Let's talk about access to the music industry.
Yeah.
Was it easy for you with your act, with your language, with your persona to break in?
I think that when you are a person of color or queer person, you risk being fetishized or just being seen as like a novelty act as opposed to like just being an artist. You have to go with the angle of being a queer artist. Like the gatekeepers, particularly in Cape Town, are not open to seeing the value in like acts like me or Angel Ho, whether they are agents or people or media people, promoters, agents, whoever owns the resources. So I'm gonna do the last verse of my track Keep in Touch. It's basically about me coming into my own and not needing the gatekeepers anymore. It goes like this. You used to race me by, but these days you always try. Everybody wants the pie, trying to flex because we quiet. Lawyer, doctor, paramedic, fashion girl, and academic. Everybody wanna get it with my appetite could wet it. Stop all your bleep performing. When I walk in the club, why you always yawning? Keep in touch, you stubby and you're boring. I don't Tai Chi, I vogue in the morning.
I don't Tai Chi, I vogue in the morning.
Keep in touch, vogue in the morning. Keep in touch.
The BBC's Audrey Brown speaking to the South African hip-hop star Dope St. Jude. So, Dope St. Jude says she vogues in the morning, but what exactly is voguing?
So in my track I say, I don't Tai Chi, I vogue in the morning. Voguing is a type of dance that was kind of made popular in the 80s. It's like a very flamboyant dance championed by black gay men. And often you'll have them in clubs like dressed in heels. And yeah, we just wanted to include that.
I don't Tai Chi, I vogue in the morning.
So as we heard, voguing was born in the underground, in the marginalised communities in Harlem in New York City. The name comes from the fashion magazine. Dancers would imitate the poses of the models splashed across Vogue's pages. The dance move had its mainstream moment with Madonna's 1990 hit Vogue. I, like many others did, strike a pose listening to that song back then. But way before that, voguing was seen as a way for queer people of colour to feel empowered, while their lives were often surrounded by homophobia, racism and poverty. Well, over the last few decades, voguing has exploded internationally, from New York to New Zealand, Japan to Slovakia, as the BBC's Saskia Edwards found out.
I've come to a small, sticky nightclub under a discount fashion outlet in Slovakia's capital, Bratislava. Saskia, S-A-S-K-I-A. The ceiling is covered in panels of LED lights that are cast in purple, green, and blue beams on a makeshift runway. There are people throwing their arms into geometric shapes while wearing patent leather, fishnets, and chains. Competitors have travelled to this obscure underground venue from places like Germany, the Czech Republic, and in the case of Gregor Kramer, the nearby Austria.
While you're doing it, and when you're really in it, you forget about everything that somebody else might say. You don't have to conform to anything anymore. You're feeling it, and you know you're feeling it, and you know it's undeniably fierce.
Who's gonna get the prize?
The people around me, they're like, oh, word, yes, oh, honey, yes.
Also here is 33-year-old Ina Hola.
I loved it from the first time on because it has so much attitude, super brave, super confident, homosexual attitude. I felt, okay, this is it.
Ina's been doing voguing classes for about a year and a half. And I should mention that she refers to herself as a fat lesbian, but it's in a reclaimed kind of way.
I found voguing because I searched for a safe space for a sport I could do. As a fat lesbian, it's not that easy to find a place where you feel comfortable and where you feel safe.
Voguing is a movement born out of discrimination, which is something both Gregor and Ina say they can relate to.
Of course, I had people follow me, and I also got into fights because people were, calling me a ladyboy or whatever. I learned how to behave like a straight man so I wouldn't be spooked, as they say, right?
Every queer person has experienced at least once in a lifetime discrimination. It already begins with the fear of coming out.
My mom was also from a Mormon background. She would say to us, 2 of the things that we could do to break her heart is either take drugs or be gay. When I started developing feelings that maybe translated to homosexuality, I would just push them back and be like, oh, that's not me.
And were you afraid to talk to your parents?
So deeply. So deeply. They were like, what we have done wrong, how can you do that to us?
Both Gregor and Ina say their relationships with their parents are really good now, even though it took time. That includes with Gregor's mum. Did you ever say to her, hey, do you remember that time you told me that it would break your heart if I was gay?
Oh, of course. I remember telling her just last year, and she said, oh, you're really dumb when you're young sometimes.
It was actually before he was out that Gregor discovered voguing. When he was a teenager, his friend suggested he should go to a class that was being held in Paris.
And they had invited Archie Burnett, the grandfather of the legendary House of Ninja, which is like a street gang in voguing. And I remember this 6-foot-tall, muscular man standing in the front of this room, striking a pose, and he points at me through the room and he goes, work. I was hooked from the very first moment, so I looked up where Archie was from, figured out that he taught at Perry Dance in New York City. And I told my mom I would book a flight to New York.
Gentlemen, it's our pleasure to welcome you to New York, where the local time is at
I came to Manhattan. So many things happened to me, but the one thing that stayed pretty consistent was me going to voguing class 3 times a week.
At 18, Gregor came back from New York to try to promote a voguing scene in Central Europe. He set up halls in Austria, while they also exist in Stockholm, Berlin, Prague, Rome. And here's where I should add something controversial about the voguing scene in Europe. I would be remiss not to add that the vast majority of people walking in the ball in Bratislava are white. And it's something the European voguing scene in general has come under scrutiny for. What do you have to say to people who say, you know what, white people, this wasn't designed for white people and this is cultural appropriation?
To be honest, I probably would say you're right, really. I thought about that too. Okay, am I really, let's say, allowed to do that? But still, it's for me the only safe space as a fat lesbian person. So I wouldn't want to give up. I think it's really, really important not to forget the roots and where it comes from.
I think if you look at the time span of the existence of voguing, it has changed what it means to different people at different times. But you also have to remember that these people were the ones that wanted to take it somewhere else. And this is what started happening around the 2000s, that voguing dancers of the scene came to Europe to teach the style. Now you can't go into a room, teach people some cool tricks and make them feel really good about themselves by doing certain moves, and then tell them, well, once you leave that door, you cannot do this anymore. So now voguing very much is a global phenomenon, and you have to accept that and take that into account while still having critical conversations about it.
Welcome to the Ball of Shame. So, we're about to start.
Regardless of the debate, the ball in Bratislava goes ahead, and it's actually a big night for Ina.
It's my first time on a ball ever, and I'm pretty nervous about it.
Yeah, so you should explain what you're going to do tonight.
I'm in the category sex siren. It's about built-up sexual seduction, but also with voguing moves.
How serious is it to walk in a voguing ball?
It's super serious. It's super serious. I will be getting judged. At the end, there is only one winner for one category.
So, that's all.
Every little detail gets pulled apart. where you place your hands on your hips, how you give a look, when to turn, everything is analyzed.
So after waiting for more than an hour, it's time for Ina's category.
Alright, sex sirens, are you ready?
Ina steps out in a black outfit, a hat at first covering her face. Then slowly she dances towards the judges. She makes it through the first round, even though she doesn't believe it.
Yes, I think I was strong. No, you got through. Okay, go back.
And she actually makes it all the way to the final, beating out some 10 other people. Now's the moment when Ina finds out if she wins. Ina gets 1 vote, but her competitor gets 2. So we're walking home? Yeah. How do you...
Yeah, I'm so happy. Second place, it's awesome. Most of the people wouldn't think that I could do that because I was so shy and I was so bullied. There is a crowd that love you and that's awesome.
And so did you feel loved?
Yes. Yes.
The BBC's Saskia Edwards on voguing. So we just heard how voguing has taken over dance floors around the world, but what could the next dance phenomenon be? Could it be bucking? It's a dance style that originates in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. It's taken the city's nightclubs by storm and has even inspired Queen Bee herself, Beyonce.
I'm Jamal Sims. I'm director of When the Beat Drops. I'm also a choreographer here in Los Angeles. Bucking is a dance style that originated back in the early 70s by this woman, Shirley Middleton, who was Jackson State University majorette. She put down her baton and started bucking on the field. And bucking can be described as pelvic thrust, very sharp, precise movements. It has a little bit of African fused with street, urban style. Historical black colleges in the South, they have big bands, they have these dancing girls, and the girls just ditched the batons and just started going crazy on the field. And bucking originated with the HBCUs, which are the historical black colleges, and people loved it. In the early 90s, boys couldn't be on the team, so what they did, the gay boys would go to the gay clubs and do this underground. That's when the first team started to develop, and before you know it, you had a bunch of teams in Atlanta that would go and battle each other in the clubs. So in a battle, what you'll see around 1 a.m. in the club, the crews will come out, the teams will take sides on either side of the floor, and you'll have a captain that will come out and he'll call out a choreographed sequence, and he'll do his, and then the team will come out and they'll repeat it. And then on the other side, then the other crew will come and they'll do their counts. And basically, it's just who does the best moves, and the crowd will decide. The boys have taken this dance style, and because they have to dance in the clubs, they have to use the music that the DJs play in the club, whether it be house music or hip-hop music. They've added flips, gymnast moves, voguing, they put it all in there, and just so it fits with the music. So it's actually taken it to a whole nother level. In Beyonce's Single Ladies, I think that would be the best representative of what bucking looks like in the mainstream. Moves are sexy, sharp, precise. If you see that, that was very inspired by bucking. I feel like these dance styles come from the gay culture because I feel like as gay people, we might not fit in with what the norm is, so we have to create our own. Voguing was based on wanting to be a model, and these boys that couldn't be models, and they knew that society wouldn't let them do what the women were doing, so they created this style for them to be able to live out their dreams. And I feel like the same thing with bucking. These are boys that couldn't be on the drill team because they were boys, and and this was feminine movement. So it's out of necessity that they have to create these dance styles because it's how they live out their dreams and their passion.
The choreographer Jamal Sims on the dance phenomenon bucking. His film When the Beat Drops, which is all about the bucking scene in Atlanta, is out next month. And that's it for this week's programme. Remember, you can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by going online to bbc.co.uk/World Service Radio and searching for us. I will be here same time next week with more stories of artists changing the world and the way we see it. Until then, goodbye.
From the Belo Center for New Media at the University of Texas, you are tuned in to KUT and KUT HD1 Austin. We are your Central Texas home for NPR and the BBC, and you can always find news online at KUT.org. I'm Jerry Quijano. Thanks for tuning in. The Get Involved Spotlight for July shines on Austin Angels, a part of the foster care community. Austin Angels works with foster children and their caretakers by offering consistent support through intentional giving, relationship building, and mentorship. Details on how to help in the Get Involved section of KUT.org. You are listening to KUT 90.5.
Hello, I'm Rory Catlin-Jones. On today's Tech 10, the European competition authorities have slapped a $5 billion fine on Google for using its dominance of the Android mobile operating system to cement its position in search. So what does that mean for the future of the Android platform? Plus, we hear about the role that Twitter plays in conversations around elections in Africa. Is there a danger that foreign voices are using it to interfere in the democratic process? And are companies and governments finally waking up to the pitfalls of placing decisions about people's lives in the hands of algorithms?
People assume that the system is somehow objective or neutral, or making a decision where it has had access to all of the relevant information. Unfortunately, that's just not the case.
That's Professor Kate Crawford from Newport University. We'll be hearing more from her in the show. My special guest today is Shona Ghosh from the Business Insider website. She'll be commenting on all of our stories. Join us both right after the news.
Hello, I'm Jerry Smith with the BBC News. Israeli military officials say there have been no further airstrikes or other operations on targets in the Gaza Strip since last night. There's also been an easing of security procedures on the Israeli border. The Palestinian group Hamas says a ceasefire has been brokered by the UN and Egypt. But on Friday, Israeli forces hit dozens of targets in Gaza, as Tom Bateman reports.
The airstrikes came after an Israeli soldier was shot dead, the first such fatality for Israel since the start of regular protests, which have seen more than 140 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces since March. Early this morning, Hamas announced a ceasefire agreement. There was no comment from Israel. The latest exchange of fire raised fears of a significant escalation between the two sides. The UN's envoy to the region warned that Gaza was on the brink of war and urged restraint.
Members of the Conservative People's Party in Spain are choosing a new leader to replace Mariano Rajoy. He's retiring after being ousted as Prime Minister in a confidence vote last month in the wake of a corruption scandal. Here's Ben Lowings.
The two candidates have been making final appeals for support at the party conference in Madrid. One is Soraya Sáenz de Santa Maria, a former Deputy Prime Minister. She was put in charge of Catalonia when the central government imposed direct rule. She argues that she's the leader to take on the socialists, populists and those who she said would break up Spain. Her challenger is Pablo Casado, a 37-year-old congressman. He's vowed to take the party further to the right. Neither contender has made any reference to Mariano Rajoy. That suggests the parties may head in a very different direction.
Facebook has suspended another data collection firm, Crimson Hexagon, from using its site, while it investigates claims that it may have been using people's information to build surveillance tools. The Wall Street Journal says the company worked with a group that had ties with the Kremlin, as well as various US government agencies. President-elect of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has called a decision of the electoral authorities to fine his party $10 million an act of vengeance. The Electoral Institute said it had broken campaign funding rules over a trust that the party said was set up for earthquake victims. Leaders of Pakistan's Ahmadi minority community say they're boycotting the forthcoming elections because of discriminatory laws. They've complained that Ahmadis have been placed on a separate voter registration list, categorizing them as non-Muslim. Community leaders say this violates their right to religious self-identity as Muslim. Rights groups say Ahmadis are one of the most persecuted groups in Sunni-majority Pakistan. They've been subjected to several violent attacks by Islamists. World news from the BBC. Police in the Indian state of Rajasthan say a mob has killed a Muslim man on suspicion of smuggling cows. In recent years, there's been a series of attacks on Muslim cattle traders and lower caste Dalits for whom beef is a staple food. Cuba's lawmakers are expected to approve a new constitution later today, which will then be put to a public vote. The reforms would see private property recognized. Foreign investments would also be encouraged. From Havana, here's Will Grant.
The new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, is seeking to preserve the socialist character of the Cuban Revolution while boosting the long stagnant economy of the island. Nevertheless, state and military-run entities will remain dominant in Cuba. Other key changes include the introduction of a prime minister to the Cuban political system, dividing the roles of head of state and head of government, and the imposition of term limits on the presidency of 2 consecutive 5-year terms.
The authorities in Japan are urging people to take precautions as a severe heatwave continues across much of the country. More than 30 people are reported to have died over the past 2 weeks. The Sri Lankan authorities say parts of the world-famous Galle Cricket Stadium could be demolished. They say the city's 17th century Dutch fort risks losing UNESCO World Heritage status because of unauthorized construction nearby. Here's Ambarasana Tiraju.
Overlooking the sparkling blue Indian Ocean, the Galle Cricket Stadium is one of the most picturesque cricket grounds in the world. The stadium was devastated during the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. The pavilion stand was rebuilt 4 years later. Now the authorities say this stand violates heritage laws protecting the fort. There is stiff opposition to demolish the entire stadium, and it's been suggested that the pavilion be removed and temporary stands erected when tests are played.
And that's the BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Tech Tent, your weekly guide to all the hottest news and trends in the technology business. I'm Rory Kessler-Jones, and this week we'll be asking how Google will respond to that record-breaking EU fine over how Android works. We'll find out how Twitter bots are invading African elections, and we meet the woman trying to get the artificial intelligence industry to take ethics seriously. Joining me this week is BBC technology reporter Jane Wakefield. Hi Jane.
Hello Rory.
Good to have you back. And my special guest is Shona Goat from the news site Business Insider UK. Welcome Shona.
Hello.
Here's a flavour of what's coming up.
Just over half of the most influential voices on Twitter originated from outside the countries in which the elections were being contested.
They changed the algorithm so it would read 100% detain. So it was a predictive algorithm that only had one answer.
All of that soon. First this week, another big blow struck against an American tech giant by the European Union. It came in the form of a record $5 billion fine on Google for using its mobile Android operating system to favour its products at the expense of its rivals. According to the Competition Commissioner Margareta Vestager, this anti-competitive behaviour took 3 forms. Phone makers were forced to pre-install Google Search and its Chrome browser if they wanted to use its App Store. They were paid to promote Google Search over rivals, and they were effectively banned from making their own version of Android. Here's what Commissioner Vestager had to say about the consequences of the fine at her press conference.
The fine of 4.34 billion euros reflects the seriousness and the sustained nature of Google's violation of EU antitrust rules. The decision requires Google to bring its illegal conduct to an end within 90 days in an effective manner. At a minimum, our decision requires Google to stop and not to re-engage in the 3 types of restrictions that I have described. In other words, our decision stops Google from controlling which search and browser apps manufacturers can pre-install on Android devices Google's sole responsibility to make sure that it changes its conduct in a way that brings the infringement to an effective end. We will monitor this very closely.
So that was Margareta Vestager, and Google sees all of this as a threat to a business model where it provides a thriving but mildly regulated Android ecosystem in return for earning revenue via mobile ads. Its chief executive Sundar Pichai hinted that it might even have to start charging phone makers for Android. Then, the day after the ruling, came this tweet from Donald Trump. "I told you so. The European Union just slapped a $5 billion fine on one of our great companies, Google. They truly have taken advantage of the US, but not for long." The trade body representing US tech firms was not impressed either. Gary Shapiro is president of the Consumer Technology Association. He told the BBC what he made of the European Commission's move.
I think the EC decision is rather bizarre. Google is providing a free service to literally billions of people. It's created over 24,000 different product opportunities for people and also for developers of apps. And it's created a standard, and it's free. Literally hundreds of billions, if not billions, of people around the world are benefiting from this free service. This is a very European, first world problem to try to deny a service and make something illegal, which should be applauded. It hurts people around the world, it hurts business people, and it is a innovation tax. Europe has 1/5 the unicorns, the companies with $1 billion valuation compared to the US. And you have to ask yourself why. What is Europe not doing that the US is doing?
That's Gary Shapiro. So what happens next? Our special guest is Shona Ghosh from Business Insider UK. You've been following it closely, Shona. Let's split it up. What does Google do next first? Does it obey the commands from the European Commission, and then does it actually set about raising the price of Android, or actually charging for Android, which is free at the moment?
So Google said it's going to appeal the decision, so it's not 100% clear what happens if Google doesn't then sort of carry on what the Commission asked for, which was to stop these contracts with phone makers and remove, or sort of stop asking them to install Google Search as a default app and Chrome as a default browser. But the Commission said, if you carry this on after 90 days, we'll keep fining you, essentially. So, it's possible that Google may have already made moves to appease the Commission, and if it does sort of follow the Commission's instructions to the letter, it's possible that Android phones could become more expensive, because what now is Google's incentive to provide Android, the operating system, for free to phone makers like Samsung and Huawei.
They're not going to suddenly stop making money from mobile ads, though.
It's true, but there's no longer such a guarantee, because when it had Google Search, when it could pay manufacturers to pre-install Google Search, and many phones sort of came with Google Search as a default, it could really rely on the mobile search revenue, and now there's something putting that at risk. So you're right, it seems unlikely that people would install much else, but it's the fact that there's now sort of a much bigger risk than there used to be. So what's their incentive to keep providing Android for free?
And, obviously the European Commission is trying to change Google's behaviour and change the market, but is it likely that it will suddenly see, 1,000 search apps bloom, people's behaviour change, a lot more innovation in that space?
It's a good question. So obviously in some countries like Russia, Google isn't the default search engine. So actually there are some markets where it really could make an impact, and you could get local competitors who are probably never going to be as big as Google globally, but may do very well in their own markets as a result of, the Commission sort of forcing these changes.
And as for the United States and retaliation, we heard that threat from Donald Trump. He's actually got a track record of carrying out some of these threats.
It's true. I'm not sure what the fine has to do with the sort of trade war against the EU, but it doesn't help that he's sort of equating the EU fine as some sort of penalty against the US in general. So he's due to meet President Juncker, I think, next week, and so I'm sure it'll come up in the discussion.
Jane Wakefield, this fits into a whole pattern of clashes between the EU and the US over tech, doesn't it?
Yes, Google shouldn't feel picked on, although obviously last year it was fined $2.7 billion for driving users to its own shopping platform through search, so it maybe feels a little bit hard done by, but it's not alone. So Apple in 2016 was asked to pay back nearly $14 billion in unpaid taxes. We've seen Facebook fined over misleading European authorities over its acquisition of WhatsApp. Qualcomm, the chip maker, was penalised at the beginning of this year, 1.2 billion for asking Apple to use only its chips. You know, this is a pattern, and the message is loud and clear. These large tech firms can come to Europe, but they absolutely have to play by Europe's rules.
Well, I'm sure we'll be reporting on another clash over the coming months. But let's move on. Let's have a look at some of the week's other top tech stories with Jane Wakefield. Jane, WhatsApp acts to try to stop the terrible impact of rumours in India.
Yes, so there's been pressure from the Indian authorities on WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, as we know, to deal with the spread of false messages in the country. These messages have been about alleged child abductors and have led to mass beatings of more than a dozen people in the country, and some of those people have died. So WhatsApp is now saying that a single person in the country can only forward a message 5 times. Of course, this does not stop other members from the group from forwarding them a further 5 times, and it also means that some of these groups have up to 256 people in them, so you can kind of do the maths on that, but it's attempting to limit the spread of mass forwarding. And it's also removing the quick forward button, which is next to messages that contain pictures or video. And India represents WhatsApp's largest market with more than 200 million users. This latest move is part of a wider attempt by Facebook to deal with the spread of hate speech and false information.
Talking of that, another PR disaster for Mark Zuckerberg with remarks he made about Holocaust deniers on Facebook.
Yeah, so Mr. Zuckerberg thought it was a very nice chat with tech website Recode on a wide range of matters, but he started speaking about Holocaust deniers when he was asked about how the social network is dealing with fake news and hate speech. Completely unprompted, he said that while he finds Holocaust deniers very offensive, they should be allowed on the site because they are not intentionally getting their facts wrong. Now, this has caused a huge backlash from lots of people criticising him, including Jewish groups and others, lots of comments on Twitter. So he later issued a retraction saying that he very much enjoyed the conversation, but that he did not intend to defend the intent of people who deny the Holocaust. But the problem was he sort of had a bit, and Facebook faced, as you say, yet another PR crisis.
Shona Ghosh, it seemed to go quiet for a while, didn't it, that the Facebook crisis has really come roaring down on lots of fronts. Basically, the key question being how to deal with offensive, abusive, dangerous content across a range of platforms.
Yeah, it's very clear that they seem to be trying a range of options, like using artificial intelligence to moderate speech and hiring more human moderators to look at hate speech. But unfortunately, when you're a platform that big and trying to essentially represent the entire world, it then becomes a very tough problem to work out how you regulate the speech of the entire world, but while also sort of billing yourself as a community that's safe and something that's about connecting people. So they haven't really sort of dealt with this identity crisis.
And meanwhile, it doesn't seem to be harming their shares, still crumbling around towards record levels. And Jane, one last story. Makers of a 3D printed gun won a Kiwi case.
So you may recall back in 2013, the first 3D printed gun was fired in America, and the blueprints for that gun were downloaded thousands of times online, which obviously alarmed the US State Department, which ordered them to be removed. Cue a 4-year legal battle in which the firm that made the gun, Defence Distributed, teamed up with the Second Amendment Foundation, which of course has been defending the right to own guns since the 1970s. They've just won their case, and the blueprints go back online on the 1st of August. And the self-styled crypto-anarchist Cody Wilson, who runs Defence Distributed, has hailed it as the dawn of the age of the downloadable gun, which sounds very worrying. Critics particularly worry that it could lead to the rise of so-called ghost guns, which are unregistered weapons that the government cannot track.
Also a test for global sort of legislation, because that's legal in America. I'm not sure it'll be legal in other parts of the world. You're listening to Tech 10 on the BBC World Service with Rory Catlin-Jones. In a moment, why the AI system that turns you down for a job may not be impartial. Heard a lot about the role social media played in the US presidential election a couple of years ago, with Facebook accused of spreading fake news and being a vehicle for Russian interference. But this week, new research by the PR firm Portland looked at the impact of Twitter on elections in Africa. It came up with some startling conclusions about the influence of outsiders on discussions and the prevalence of bots sending automated tweets. But in a continent where Facebook plays a much bigger role, I asked Portland's partner for Africa, Robert Watkinson, whether Twitter really had that much influence.
Yes, I think we can establish that Twitter played an important role in all of the elections that we studied over this period. In some of those elections, and Kenya is a good case in point, Twitter was probably more to the fore in shaping the discussion around the election. And of course, we were looking at how Twitter influences the conversation around elections, not necessarily the outcome of the elections, and that's an important distinction to make. There are really three broad conclusions emerging from our study. The first is the degree to which external voices influence discussions around elections. Just over half of the most influential